Welcome to the Africa Speaking Podcast. The podcast discusses critical issues about the African continent. It is brought to you by Toyeza Communications in Nairobi. My name is Kimani Njogu. Our guest today is historian and writer Zarina Patel. For purposes of our listeners, if you could just introduce yourself a little, then we'll move on to the topic.
When I think of myself, I really think of the landmark moments in my life, which made a huge impression and changed the course of my thinking. Okay, I think the first influence that really impacted on my thinking was religion. When I was, I must have been about 9 years old. And I come from the Bohra community, which is a Shia Ismaili sect. And we have the tradition of confirming children around that age. I think all religions do have that, some kind of, ceremony. And that's where I first began to question religion.
You were questioning the Bohra religion?
Yes.
As a young woman?
I was questioning that ceremony and the, I wanted to know what the high priest would say to me. And of course he does it all in Arabic. And my parents told me, that's all right, you just have to say yes, to everything he says. And I said, no, I can't. I must know what he is telling me, asking me, And when I was informed that he will ask you if you will pray regularly, if you will fast, all the rest of it. I said, I can't say yes to that because I knew I was going to go for further studies to Britain, and there's no way I could do all these things there. And I was told, don't worry about that, you just say yes.
So just say yes, and here you are as a young person asking questions and saying, I have a right to say no.
So that really set me off on a whole trajectory. And I came to realize that there's no one religion which has got all the answers.
Yeah, actually, all religions do not have answers. You have more and more questions, but of course the idea here is that you go by faith and so on. For today, I really want us to discuss with you, Zarina Patel, about the work you have done, related to trade unionists, because I know you've done quite a bit of work. And I want us to start from the beginning, really, with the question, in your view, at what point did trade unions become a factor in Kenya's history? Because if we are to assume that trade unions are really about workers organizing themselves for their benefits, whether those benefits are political benefits or economic benefits or even social benefits. In the case of Kenya, when do we start seeing this trade union, sensibility, consciousness?
Fine. I think we need to go, Kimani, a bit earlier and look at the imposition of the wage system in our country. And of course, we didn't have Kenya then. I'm talking of the very late 19th century. And the building of the railways brought in the capitalist wage system, which I think, and I think generally accepted, that the wage system in itself is built in to create labor unrest. Because of the alienation and the exploitation of labor and the profit motives of the employer. Okay, so you've got an area of conflict there. So there was labor unrest ever since we started building the railway. The only difference was that it didn't get organized. And also on top of the wage system was the colonial factor. So now you had Indians, Europeans, and Africans operating separately. So getting that unity of the workers also was difficult. So if I can just go back, you had these groups of workers who were organizing and who were bringing up matters of labor injustice. Okay? But as the economy developed in the urban and the rural areas, workers became more and more aware of their exploitation and began to make demands. Okay. In the 1910s, I would say, and certainly 20s, 30s, 40s, there was a very sizable Kenyan left in this country. It was the left that was consisted of the Indian laborers who had migrated from the north of India, recruited on the railway, and had then settled here.
And they were basically workers. They were working,
They were workers.
the workers on the railway
Yes,
line.
yes, they're artisans and
of course
workers.
yeah.
And they came from a tradition of, in India at that time, of ideological development, of a very vibrant labor organization and struggle for workers' rights. So they came with that knowledge, and they were settled here. So in 1914, they formed the Indian Trade Union. That was in Mombasa and in Nairobi. In 1914.
1914.
Yeah.
So almost like soon after the railway line was completed.
Yeah, yes, right.
And it's very significant that this is the railway line from Mombasa all the way to Uganda. It's a
Right.
Kenya-Uganda railway line.
Right.
And Mombasa is the beginning, so that...
And they were settling in Nairobi, in Nakuru, in Kisumu,
yeah.
and beyond,
So 1914.
Yeah, 1914. 1919, you've got the European workers forming the Workers' Federation of the of British East Africa. That's what they called it.
The Workers' Federation of British East Africa. Yeah, because at that time we are still dealing with British East Africa.
Yeah, right, right. And then in 1919, another group of Indians formed the Indian Employees Association. So my guess is that it wasn't as ideologically to the left as the previous Indian Trade Union. Mm-hmm. And then Harry Thuku's East Africa Association was not only a political association, it was an association of workers.
So suddenly now there is convergence between the workers' consciousness and the political activities that are taking place, so that they are agitating not just for the rights of workers in terms of wages and welfare, but also making certain political demands.
Exactly. And another important thing is that they're not only working in their ethnic conclave. They're now reaching out beyond those boundaries.
So Harry Thuku coming from central Kenya, working closely with...
and organizing in Nairobi, which is a totally cosmopolitan place.
In those earlier days.
Yes.
So working with the Luo, working with the Luhya, working with the Indian community.
He was the first African leader who broke through the boundaries of ethnicity. He couldn't break through the race boundaries, because that was instituted by the colonialists. But he certainly broke through the ethnic boundaries,
So a certain class consciousness which transcends ethnic identity. So the class consciousness as a working class becoming possible, right from the onset in terms of labor and labor's engagement with capital in those earlier stages. And I would be quite interested in hearing from you, talk a little more about how then the workers' associations, in those earlier days, start making political demands, because it seems like they are moving from just questions of labor, questions of welfare, to questions of politics. And Harry Thuku leading in that process. Yeah, and if you could also just, share with me a little bit about whether there are certain solidarities with the Indian employees of the time, whether Harry Thuku is reaching out to them or not.
There was a very close relationship, actually. We forget, we tend to think that we are very sharply divided in those times. Yes, we were racially very, very, there were real boundaries, and you couldn't work and organize cross-race, all right? But they couldn't stop people from being, again, in the anti-colonial struggle. They couldn't. So what you got is, say, if you go back to the 1914, Jeevanjee forms the East African Indian National Congress.
Jeevanjee I mean, we remember him because of Jeevanjee Gardens.
Right.
So he forms the
East African Indian National Congress.
Yes.
It's designed on the National Congress in India, Indian National Congress. And basically, he does it because he wants to bring all the various Indian communities down under one umbrella. And there's a whole lot of ethnic communities in the Indian community, okay? So that was the intention. And then they have branches all over the country. In that, he recruits a man called Manilal Desai, who has just come from India. He come to work as a law clerk here and with a European firm. And then he stalks out because he feels one day he's smoking a cigar and he's told, put it out, you're not allowed. And yet everybody, all the Wazungus are smoking cigars. So he says, why can't I smoke a cigar? And he walks out of the...
That is Desai.
That's Desai. And Jeevanjee picks him up and recruits him as General Secretary of the Congress. Desai is a bachelor alone and very, very political. He meets Harry Thoku, who is also a bachelor. Both are living sort of out of their normal home circumstances, right? So they get together and share their politics, okay? And of course they're all, immersed in the anti-colonial sentiments. Desai starts a newspaper called the East African Chronicle, and he has a press.
He had a press.
Yes, he had a press, the Chronicle press. Okay, and it really was the voice of the colonized as such. Thuku, being African, is not allowed to own a press, right? So Desai agrees to print his Tangazo leaflet. It's a tabloid, actually.
Yeah.
So Harry Thuku not only cut across ethnic boundaries, he was also the first African leader to use the media, the print media, to spread his political message.
And we're talking about the very early stages of colonial presence in Kenya. So it seems like the consciousness was rather immediate. It seems like people, Harry Thuku is moving very, very quickly.
Yes.
Yeah. With working with Desai.
Yes, because the Indians, of course, were coming with a much older tradition, both of the press and of fighting colonialism in India.
Absolutely.
And they were sharing this now with the African population, And in fact, when Harry Thuku used to go out into the rural areas and hold his political rallies, he used to go in Jeevanjee's car.
Wow.
Which had a Maasai chauffeur, Haikoko. So you could see they were breaking ethnic boundaries.
Ethnic and racial boundaries, actually, in those very early stages.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Wow.
I don't think Jeevanjee ever met Thuku.
Yes.
Or knew him, But this is the way they interacted, thoughts and ideas. At one point, the British were, from the start, very wary of any African-Indian of them coming together.
Yes.
Because they could see the danger of this association, So they kept trying to put down the Indians. Right? Even when in 21, then they go to London, there's the Devonshire Declaration.
Yeah, the Devonshire Declaration of 1920.
Yes, 22 actually. 22.
Yes.
And M.A. Desai was leading that delegation. Then the British declared the African interest was paramount. With no intention at all of doing anything about that, At that time, they really pushed forward the idea that your problems are caused by the Indian presence in this country. And at that time, Thuku's organization sent a telegram to London to say Indians are our best friends.
So he's the East African Association. So again, Harry Thuku standing, in solidarity with the Indian,
exactly,
and kind of challenging the British interpretation of the African problem.
And you see, even to meet for across races was very difficult for leaders to get together. So Jeevanjee Villa became the place for meetings of the both leaders on both sides, you know.
So fast forward from, because that is now, in terms of period, 1910s.
I said to you, after 1919, we had these
1919,
small
yes.
groupings, the Indian Trade Union,
Correct.
the Employees Association, all that. Then in 1933, actually, in the railway, Indian artisans were demoted by the colonialists from being permanent staff to temporary staff.
In 1933.
1933.
Yes.
So at that time, the Indians got together again, and in December 1934, they held a huge mass meeting, and they formed the Indian Workers' Trade Union to protest against this particular incident. And over 500 people, which is a big number in those days.
Absolutely, in those days, 500, huge numbers.
Working class people attended that meeting. And history has recorded that there was a total absence of any kind of racial, religious, or communal division. They were totally united. But they realized also that somehow all these attempts have not been sustained. You will come together, fight for an issue, it is resolved or one way or the other, and then people disband. Largely because of the hostility from the colonial forces and the hostility of the employers.
Correct.
They don't want unions, right?
Correct, because of course it challenges power and challenges capital. I mean,
exactly.
And at that time, of course, the whole focus was extraction of resources and extraction of labor to take care of British interests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, because of that total lack of any kind of labor legislation, right? And then, of course, the worst thing was that because industry was so much in its infancy, so undeveloped, workers would be moving from job to job.
Yes.
So that migratory kind of labor was difficult to organize, to sustain.
Yeah.
So in 1935, now Makhan Singh, I'm jumping a bit, but Makhan Singh, his father had come earlier and brings Makhan Singh over in 1927. And the family, his wife and all the other children.
So Makhan Singh also comes from India.
India.
Yeah.
He comes from India. He lived very close to Amritsar, where the great massacre had taken place. I don't know if you are aware of it, the Amritsar massacre, where this Colonel Dyer and his troops massacred hundreds of Indians who had gathered to celebrate a religious festival in the gardens in Amritsar, you know. And so many other things going on around him at that time, okay? The agitation, anti-colonial agitation, the labor struggles and all that. So he had actually studied these, imbibed this, and then he comes to...
So the labor consciousness that exists in India in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s finds expression really in Kenya, because these people are coming and they are already conscious that it is important for labor to resist capital, for labor to stand up, to be, to build solidarities and so on. And so Makhan Singh comes with his father.
His father came earlier, and he was an artisan he was actually a carpenter, recruited to work on the railways, okay? And he tries to form a union of workers in the railways, and then finally gets dismissed. And then he sets up a printing press of his own.
Alongside Desai's...
By that time, Desai has died. 1926, Desai died.
Okay.
And his chronicle newspaper has been shut down by the colonialists. That's another story.
Yeah, because of its radicalizing capacity.
Right.
Yeah. So Makhan Singh now
Comes as a 27-year-old. He joins what is now the Jamhuriya high school. Right? What was it? The Duke of Gloucester or something.
Yes,
In those days. Yeah.
Yes, Jamhuri High School, very close to what is now Moranga Road.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. And does brilliantly. He was a brilliant student. But then, his family, his father could not afford to send him for further education. So he joins a printing press, all right? And he starts working with the workers on the floor, okay? He insists that he wants to be there not as an owner, but as a worker.
Makhan Singh.
That age, He comes in 27. He was born in 1913.
Okay. So he's very young.
He's a very
young person.
He's very young. So these workers who have formed Indian Workmen's Trade Union, okay, realizing that they keep meeting together and then disbanding and, they're not getting anywhere. And Makhan Singh completes his education, okay, in 1933. So they asked, in 1935, they asked Makhan Singh if he would take on the task of working in this organization and getting it, onto a firm footing. Makhan Singh is 23 years old. He takes on the task as the honorable secretary of the organization. So there's no remuneration.
Wow.
Okay? And he begins to organize it. And he starts with regular management committee meetings, membership fees, changes the name from the Indian Trade Union to the Labour Trade Union, LTU.
So he's moving now from the racial,
because he has
concentration.
He needs to bring in the African workers.
Absolutely.
Okay? And then later they changed the name even to LTUEA because they include then later became the Uganda and Tanganyika.
So he's evolving into a labor trade union, East Africa.
Right.
Again, to bring in the workers, not just from Kenya.
Of East Africa.
Of East Africa. Yeah. So he's developing a consciousness, a regional consciousness.
Right. And then he acquires the technology which enables him to type letters to the press, print handbills, posters, campaign material, pamphlets in English, Swahili, Gujarati, and Urdu.
Multilingual, completely multilingual,
yes.
Very conscious of the linguistic scenario.
Exactly.
In Nairobi and in Kenya, actually in East Africa at the time.
In East Africa, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, that was really quite remarkable.
Absolutely remarkable. I mean, some of the issues that we are dealing with now about communicating, broadly, he was already ahead.
Yes.
In terms of seeing that you can do press in Urdu, Gujarati, Swahili, English, and so on, and reach out to all these working class people.
Right. And then they start demanding improvement in wages, conditions of work, demanding an end to forced labor. That was particularly Harry Tuku's strong point.
So that is now in the 1930s, 1940s, right?
Yeah.
Then suddenly we have the emergency. So Makhan Singh is already situating himself.
So let's say he was a good organizer. Mm-hmm. He was a trade unionist. Mm-hmm. He was an excellent communicator who understood and empathized with the workers. And he insisted on non-alignment with any international trade union. So the ICFTU, International Congress of
I know
the names.
I mean,
from the US or the Russia or the USSR, the FTU.
So he wanted the trade union.
He wanted completely independent. Yeah. It was East African, and that was it.
To push the agenda of the working class in East Africa without undue influence by other trade union agendas, whether those are British or American.
Right. He wanted total independence, but he did, from the start, he saw the struggle between capitalists and workers as being ideological. Okay? Through all this, the workers learned how to unite, how to fight for their rights, and to be prepared to self-sacrifice. That was a very important. I mean, that Makhan Singh in his own lifestyle demonstrated it, to all his followers and members.
So the self-sacrifice, the organizing, the really devotion, and so on.
Right. And getting over, religious differences, ethnic differences.
Building solidarities based on the interest of the workers.
So trade union branches were formed all over East Africa then.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you get the LTUEA.
Yeah.
In 1939, they're celebrating May Day. And the Africans, workers joining, that's the time when Africans really began to see the benefit of being in a trade union.
So at that time, of course, now, as you say, it's basically the Labour Trade Union of East Africa, and the agendas are East Africa. They are not necessarily national. It's working class.
Yeah, but Indians.
Yeah, but then there are branches.
Okay, Indians.
Yeah.
And the Africans are watching.
Correct.
To see how it's going,
Correct.
And on that May Day in 1939, they made the decision to join. And they joined in vast numbers. The entire sort of African working class came over, And the colonial government was seriously alarmed, at this coming together of the Indians and the Africans. Okay, it was in 91 or 2, I think, that Bill Clinton in the States made this famous statement. It is the economy, stupid.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes, I remember.
Yeah.
It is the economy, stupid. It's always about capital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you see, the workers had realized this a long time ago, ever since the 1917 October Revolution, in fact.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
This is the Bolshevik revolution, yes.
So the real danger for colonialism was worker involvement. Not the presidents and leaders, They were there just as an image.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Then we had World War II. So things, came to us, all kinds of organizing came to a full stop. Okay. In 1944, they formed COW. There had been KCA before.
Yeah. The Kikuyu Central Association.
Banned. And then COW was formed in 1944. In 1947, you had this huge strike in Mombasa, the Mombasa General Strike. 15,000 African workers took part.
This is 1947.
1947.
It's very interesting because at that same year, there was the Dock Workers Union in Zanzibar also organizing a huge strike. So it seems like these things are happening within the East African region. It would be interesting to find out whether there were any, what they coordinated.
And did this LTUEA extend that far?
Yes,
what influence it had?
Yeah, it would be something that, we can check later to see whether the Mombasa strike of 1947
had any
connection, the Dock Workers Union strike in Zanzibar. Because that points to a certain East African consciousness and solidarity.
The Mombasa strike was not a dock worker strike.
Yeah, it was general.
It was a general strike. It was general strike. Yes. And it was led by 28-year-old Chege Kibashia.
Chege Kibashia.
That's right.
Of course.
And he was head of the African Workers' Federation. Chege was ideologically very well read, but had very little experience in organizing. So ultimately, the strike failed. It lasted 12 days.
Yeah, which is significant.
Yes.
I mean, 12 days is significant.
Right.
I mean, nowadays the strikes don't last 2 days. So really 12 days is quite significant. In those earlier days,
Yeah. So Chege was arrested with 12 other people. They were defended by advocates. Now, interesting, the names. O'Brien was an advocate. Nene, I think, was a Kikuyu.
yeah, Nene could be either Kikuyu or it could be Taita.
Or it could be Indian, you know.
Or it could be Indian, yes.
One of my best friends is a doctor, Nene. So, and then a Patel, some Patel.
Yeah.
Okay. So even the defense team, you know.
Yeah. Again, multi-ethnic,
Yes.
multi-ethnic, multi-racial.
Right. And then he was found guilty and he was detained in Cabernet for 10 years. Chege Kibashe.
So, very interesting. Again, very, very interesting because, so the strike takes place in Mombasa,
Yeah.
but he's detained in Cabernet, which is in the Rift Valley,
Yeah.
in a generally dry area and so on.
And far away.
And far away.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you're being moved away from the community
Yeah.
where you are known and you have solidarities
Right.
to, far-flung other spaces.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to re-emerge
Yeah.
as a traditional leader, you know.
So what happens? What happens?
So many things going on at that time. 1947, we get the establishment of the Daily Chronicle newspaper.
Daily Chronicle newspaper,
Newspaper.
1947.
And that is founded by a group of intellectual South Asian leftists who are determined to both expose and to oppose the colonial administration. So the Chronicle becomes really at that time the only voice in English which can be internationally broadcast about what the injustices of the British colonial system in Kenya.
Absolutely. And this is happening almost soon after the Second World War. I mean, the Second World War ends in 1945.
Right.
And now more radical reflection and more internationalization of the grievances.
And
through
don't
the
forget,
Chronicle. Yes.
India has got its independence,
Absolutely.
you know. And that's very important also, because it gives greater strength and vigor to the Indian left in this country. Also, at the same time, in the UK, Labour was in power,
Correct.
comes into power.
Correct.
So they also have a much more sympathetic approach to the Kenyan situation.
So more radical thinking is taking place in Kenya within the context of a certain global trends, whether those trends are in India, which has huge influence on Kenya, or in Britain, which is the colonial power in the case of Kenya.
Right. Where also the pretty radical things are happening. Isn't the National Health Service was formed then in that period, you know, when that Labour government came into power. So quite some ideological moves.
Yeah.
Makhan Singh then becomes a friend of the group in the Chronicle.
Yes.
Okay?
Uh-huh.
So now the workers have got another avenue to make their demands and, you know, for justice and their rights. Okay.
And the Chronicle is clearly leftist in terms of its...
and it also becomes like a meeting ground. So the young African leaders also start visiting the Chronicle. Makhan Singh is there, you know, and the journalists are there. This is the real force against the colonialists. Okay. Makhan Singh is also holding classes on Marxism for that Chronicle team. And they were often joined by comrades from South Africa, Dadu, Naika. So these people, you know, used to travel, I don't know, to Moscow or wherever, and would stop over here in Nairobi and meet with these people.
So the South African left is also providing input into the ideological direction of the Kenyan working class and the journalists and others. And of course, so there is this almost class education, as it were.
Right.
In those earlier stages.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Then added to that, see, India, by winning its independence, has now shown the world or other colonies that it's doable.
That you can actually become independent. That's actually, you can
That's
actually...
what, up till now, there was much more of a struggle for reformism.
Yeah.
But now suddenly it's like, hey, no, we can go the whole way.
Absolutely.
Demand independence, okay? Added to that are the African recruits, ex-servicemen coming back from the war.
Who had actually done service in Burma, in different parts of the world, and they're coming back.
Yeah, and who had actually seen that you can fight the white man.
Yes.
And destroy him.
Yes.
Actually
seen firsthand British generals, kind of taking cover when the African soldiers are up there,
Yeah.
So all these people are coming back. All these people are exposed to other ways of seeing the world, on the basis of the war, on the basis of the interaction with India and South Africa, and so forth and so on.
So the entire environment is like, building, coming together of many of these experiences and sentiments and struggles, Ex-servicemen coming back from the war then form a group called the Anake.
Yes,
the group of 40.
They were calling them Anakia Forte, which is basically the youth of the 40s.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because I was reading the late Kakara Wanjao's books.
Yes.
And he would, of course, say that they did a lot of things which relate to they came back with some money.
Yeah.
So they did a lot of things which were, kind of surprising.
Right.
Yeah, in terms of social formations and so on.
Yeah.
Lots of courage, they had some resources and they shifted things a little bit.
They also saw the total injustice of the British in the way they rewarded the British soldiers. And the way
the returning British soldiers were rewarded while the African returning soldiers were not rewarded.
Not only not rewarded, they come back to find they lost their land and everything.
Yes.
Right?
This concludes our first episode in our 3-part series of this podcast with historian and writer Zarina Patel. Thank you for listening to the Africa Speaking Podcast. Join us in our next episode. Brought to you by Traiza Communications. My name is Kimani Njogu. For any comments and views, you can reach us through our website, www.africaspeaking.org. You can also reach us on Facebook, Traiza Communications, or on our Twitter handle, @TrawezaComs. You can also write to us on email, info@africaspeaking.org.